Welcome everybody, bienvenidos sean todos ustedes, and we have a very particular and a very special and hopefully a hopeful reunion that we have in here because we are joined by two of the authors of one of the best horror series that I dare to say that I have read in the last decade. So without further ado, allow me to introduce tonight's guest, Jenna Chang and Lonnie Nadler. How are you doing, guys?
Hey, we're doing all right. Yeah. Thank you for saying nice things.
No, I'm not saying nice things just to say. I actually believe what I am saying, and I have been actually recommending to some of my friends, to people who is joining us right now to this conversation. I'm not saying that your work is like this decade's Watchmen, because it is not. But now that I mention it, perhaps you will get more recognition as Watchmen. So. To be quite honest, it's something that I was really excited to talk about. Actually, I contacted before Lonnie to see when you guys would have the chance to talk about this work. I am glad that the story. Actually, I was checking some of the reviews, and you guys had stellar reviews, and kudos to the entire team. I'm so glad to have you both guys in here, but kudos also to the rest of the team, because the colors, the letter, is an entire piece of work that it's an important piece of work, and when you look at all the elements combined, it's really something. So first of all, congratulations, and I will try to congratulate the rest of the team later.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So what work are we talking about? We're talking about Black Stars Above, which is a 5-issue series that was published by Bolt Comics, and we have both the artist and the writer in here, and let's talk about this series. So let's go first with you, Jenna, and then with Lon. The story, how was? Can you tell us a little bit about the process of developing this story? Like, if you guys had everything from the beginning all planned, or it was changing from issue to issue?
Yeah, we were pretty on top of the planning with everything pretty early on. Like, when me and Lonnie first spoke over the phone, we just really quickly ended up talking about everything we already like about comics and with art and stuff, and everything that we had in common taste-wise was a direct application of how we wanted the book to be. So we talked a lot about artists like Junji Ito and Gustave Doré, and Ansel Adams was an inspiration for the book. And so the process for developing the book while it was underway was actually pretty easy and pretty smooth sailing. And I think the amount of communication we had was pretty consistent, like, for the rest of the series, just because we started it off so strongly. And when we talked about this to the colorist, Brad Simpson, who was our first choice that we wanted as a colorist, we were pretty communicative about how we wanted the book to look and what the tone to be, and he just did it perfectly. So it was all very cohesive, and the team, there was no problems with any of the other team members. And Hassan too, he was our first choice for letter, and he brought this identity to the letters that made the book very. I think the letters made the book, gave the book a roundedness that we didn't expect. Just the way he did the letters in a particular manner of the line of the letters and the way the captions are boxed in. It's just it was really great to see the level that he put into it.
Yeah, I think it wasn't really till we saw the finished first issue with the colors and letters on it that both Jenna and I were like, oh, this is good. We made something that we're proud of. That's almost exactly what the vision we had in our head was at the start.
And it's you can tell because the work that you have been doing, guys, as you mentioned with Hassan and with Brad, it's really it's a really interesting combination because one of the things that it's kind of difficult, I believe, to spot is that when you get into a comic book store, into a bookstore, perhaps you go and then you see the funny books, to put it in one way. So it's really hard to actually have a personal identity. If you are working for a major editorial, for a major company like, I don't know, Marvel, DC, any of those, perhaps they can they want to put something to identify their family of titles, like, I don't know, Spider-Man, X-Men, one of those. But when you have an independent comic, a lot of those look kind of similar. However, when you go and you look, for example, to, in this case, to any of the issues that we have in here with Black Stars Above, it's really interesting because you actually can look at it and you feel part of the identity that it's in this book. It's something that is really integral, as you mentioned with the letterer, which is something really important. And I don't know if this was this will be perhaps my next question. I don't know if this was actually planned from the very beginning, but the fact that in the comic book you were using cursive lettering, for perhaps younger readers, it can be more difficult to read this kind because it's not common. Yeah. So it actually forced you to pay more attention to what's in the page. Yeah. So was that always like the first option, like we wanted like this, or?
Yeah. Before, like,
it's his master plan to force people to read the book.
Yeah, before there was even a letterer, before there was even a script, like in the pitch document, it says like this has to be done in cursive text. It has to be accurate to the period in which it was made. I actually even wanted the dialogue to be in cursive, and I wanted it to be case sensitive as well. But Hassan wanted to distinguish the captions from the dialogue a bit further, so he ended up changing that, which was definitely the right call, because I think some people, like you say, have issue reading cursive. I don't care about that, because it's like it just, that's the way the book needs to be. Yeah. And if that prevents some people from reading it, and I've gotten messages from people saying that they have a hard time reading the captions, and I'm okay with that, because for the people who it does resonate with, they get it, like they get why it is that way. And I would have just hated it if it wasn't, especially if the journal entries weren't done in handwritten style. I actually even wanted them to be handwritten, but it's hard to ask someone to do that. If I was doing it myself, I would.
And you mentioned this actually because it part of the, you have like a couple of stories in here. Well, one main story, but actually you get the connection between something that happens at the very beginning of the story with the hunter. And then you have the connection with the, sorry, I'm going to pronounce it in Spanish. Eulalia, it's the Spanish pronunciation of the original name. How do you say it in English?
Eulalie,
well, kind of similar. Sorry, I'm butchering the name.
I like the Spanish pronunciation better.
And perhaps that's the next question, because you mentioned and you have been... the portrait of the story is something that it's according to a specific time, a period of time. So the name, it's actually something that it's like the name of my grandmother or something like that. So you feel that the characters is not like something that it can be placed at any time. Why did you guys choose this particular period of time?
So it was always set during the fur trade, but the fur trade is obviously a century-spanning venture. So it was mostly about nailing down what specific point during the fur trade in Canada it was happening in. And I ultimately decided that it needed to be at the very end of the fur trade. 1887, when the book takes place, is actually like the fur trade had been considered dead for like a decade at that point. So anyone who was still doing it was kind of like, they were really holding on to the last threads of a dying industry. And the reason for that was because the book deals a lot with sort of people in between states, different states, whether it's Eulalie's being in between, adolescence and adulthood, or her being between family and the town that she's going to, and then the year chosen is because it was a big turning point for Canada as a nation. They just gained sovereignty like not too long before that, and so it was going into the a new century. Times were changing a lot, and so were roles within the family and stuff. So it all just sort of worked together to represent that idea of times in transition.
And it was really interesting because, for example, at least in my case, I was reading the last couple of issues, and I saw some of the elements that it can be recognized perhaps for somebody that it's not doesn't know a lot about the Canadian culture and Canadian history, and some of the elements that some of the visions actually illustrated some points, and for me it was really nice to see it. And actually, even though I don't know the specific moments, it was really clear for me, oh, this is something really important. So it was like a Canadian history revision for dummies. In this case, for me, I am the dummy in this case. So it was part of the elements that actually help the reader to don't feel like it's something that it's not yours. It's a story that is actually doesn't belong to you. And as we mentioned before about the kind of lettering, the different elements, the color, it's something that even though I believe the story deals with horror, deals with loneliness, actually it feels personal, and all the elements, as the lettering, as we mentioned, as the color, as the art, as a particular kind of writing, because we are following a journal, feels pretty much like something that is happening all the time in your head, but it doesn't feel foreign. One question in here, did you plan this all the time, or did you plan to perhaps introduce different kind of, I don't know, not narrators, but characters that whose voices were integrated in this story?
It was always just Eulalie and her journal voice that was going to carry everything through. There's a few reasons for that, one of which is the book is very inspired by weird fiction writers that I look up to a lot, like Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood and of course Lovecraft. And they often wrote things in this journalistic epistolary form. And so because I was trying to sort of capture that mood and atmosphere, it made sense. But the other side of it is sort of like you were suggesting, the story wouldn't work unless you were in Eulalie's head, because you need that sense of subjectivity. And if it was an objective sort of narration, it just doesn't have the same sort of weight, because you need to know that these things aren't. It's her very naive perspective as somebody who doesn't know much of the world, and she's not just experiencing other people and the rest of the world for the first time, but these like supernatural elements. And so I wanted to just heighten that by having everything filtered through such an ignorant lens. Not that she's stupid in her ignorance, it's just that's the life she had, which I think would have been the case for a lot of people growing up at that time.
And it's interesting because we have a combination of styles in the storytelling in this case. And Jenna, I would love for you to mention us how were you planning along with the rest of the team about the visual style, the visual characterization, or even the panels that you were using, because this is something that, like a common trope that I have with the friends at the Stripando, another show that we do about comics, because it's, when I see a comic book, a modern comic book, and it uses the 9 frames layout, it's because they are hunting for a niceness. So did you have that in mind when you were using this kind of panels?
Oh my god. So all the 9-panel grids are his fault. I have nothing to do with it, I swear.
Oh, so that's a yes. So Lon, you were looking for a nicer.
I was happy to draw the 9-panel grids, but he's indoctrinated me to that format. But it was kind of Lonnie's scripts are very specific in their layouts. They're specific and descriptive in the direction of the characters and the actions which coincide with the dialogue or the just like the situation of the page. He's like a very specific Alan Moore-y writer.
Oh man,
nothing to do with his craving for an Eisner, I swear. And I actually like that those kind of writers as an artist. I find that when there's direction, when I know what the writer wants, it's less pressure for me to try and figure out how they would want the page to look, like how nice they want the page to look, or how much action they want or whatever. I don't really like I don't like writers like just kind of letting the artist do whatever. That being said, Lonnie was also very open to the kind of notes that I gave him too. I think I have a particular way of storytelling that I enjoy. I try to think like a writer as much as I can. So it was kind of down the line of how the story was told and how the technical aspects of the formatting and everything.
Mm-hmm. Because also, particularly in issue, I believe it is issue 4, if I'm not mistaken, there you can see where you guys are actually breaking the, let's say, traditional layout formats. And for example, particularly in your case, Jenna, kudos, because I love the splash pages or the one-page drawings that you have in there, because you have a really nice combination. You have obviously the words, obviously the lettering, obviously the coloring, but then those are some of the moments that I believe that in particular your art really shines, even though there are black stars above in there, because you get how can I say it? You get like a moment of a pause where you actually can contemplate this particular moment, and then you can digest the entirety of the work, in this case of the art that you're showing us. So it's beautiful.
Yeah. We talked a lot about experimentation early on, about the actual like format of the comic language as a way to portray the tone of the story. And that's something I really appreciate as an artist. I think having the ability and the freedom to experiment and be as inventive as I can with the actual sequencing, that's like where my brain wants to go. That's the kind of thing I think really stimulates the comic artist that I've become. So there's plenty of opportunities I had with that stuff, especially in issue 4, which is a weird issue.
And you have
it's a little weird early on, but I think issue 4 is fun, honestly.
Yeah, because it's when pretty much well, not everything, but it's like the pretty much the climatic point of the entire story. Even though obviously you have the conclusion and you have the revelations that we are not going to say, guys. Remember that if you want to buy this story, yes, there will be available on May the 17th the trade paperback. Don't worry if you cannot go to a comic book shop. You can also order it and buy it in Comixology. Amazon, they don't give me any money for promoting them, but they have been running a lot of promotions. So perhaps you can get it in there. The artists will get their full pay, but you can get it at a better price. If not, don't worry. It's something that is really worth it. So after this commercial that I'm not getting paid, guys, you have been mentioning some of the influences that you have for this work. I would like you to mention a little bit more, because we find a lot of perhaps mixed kind of styles. We can say that we have woman versus nature, which is one traditional kind of story. We have a rite of passage. We have even a road movie. We can consider this because, after all, it happens when Eulalia, as I say it in Spanish, has to travel all the way to the north. So can you tell us, perhaps first Lonnie and then you, Jenna, some of the influences that you had for this particular story?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it really was a lot of the writers I mentioned before. Like, in particular, I was looking at Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen a lot, and then some more contemporary writers like Laird Barron and Thomas Ligotti, and then there's some Canadian writers like Margaret Atwood and Farley Mowat, who like Farley Mowat nobody knows outside of Canada, but like I grew up reading his books. He wrote for like young adults and for adults a lot about native populations in Canada, and so just all of those things sort of amalgamated into this weird hodgepodge cauldron of, and came out to be whatever Black Stars Above is. And it's been hard to promote, and then just in terms of like the genre is hard to nail down, and then there's also these like folk horror elements that like I wasn't even aware that was a genre until like partway through the book. And so there's it was just a lot of stuff going into it, and I think it was born out of because I'd co-written so many creator-owned books with Zach, and that was a medley of our influences. I wanted something that was just felt like me, at least in the planning stage before the other team members came on, and so I just sort of poured all these influences into it, and you know what came out of it thankfully made some sense.
No, it certainly did. So, and Jenna, some of your influences, perhaps for the visual style that you imprinted in the characters.
Yeah. Well, like I said, Junji Ito is just like a hero of mine. He's probably the biggest stylistic influence. Bernie Wrightson is another huge stylistic influence of mine, which is like, you know, I would never try to reach for, you know, being like him, but he's a big influence on me. I actually, to get the visual style of the book, I actually looked at a lot of old photography, especially by this photographer named Edward S. Curtis. He's famous for doing this very extensive series of portraits of Native Americans, I guess in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And I looked at him a lot because his photos are, they tend to be kind of like darkly lit with a lot of contrast. So they might seem a little somber at times, but they're also very peaceful and very just beautiful and very pleasant to look at, in my opinion. So I really liked the concept of a marriage of tones, like maybe a little dark, somber, but then beautiful in a weird way. I tried to apply that as much as I could in Black Stars Above, but I think a lot of it just ended up coming across more dark than anything.
And I think that's another writer I should reference that sort of coincides with this is like Cormac McCarthy was a really big influence. He's always an influence on the stuff I do, to a detrimental point, probably. But that sense of there's a rawness and a grittiness, and he doesn't shy away from dealing with dark subjects, but at the same time he always finds room in most of his books to give you a sense of just a little bit of relief. Like in The Road, you know, there's a point when they're sharing, I forget what it is. It's something like sweet that they're like a can of Coke, I think it is. And it's like, you know, even amidst this horrible turmoil, and then the apocalypse happened, there's still that moment between people of sharing a can of Coke that unites them. And there's a beauty in that despite the surrounding horror. And so, you know, like Jenna was talking about, just having the horror and the darkness mixed with bits of levity, I think was important for us, even if there are far and few between.
And one question, which is perhaps focus in the way that you are portraying the story, in this case for international audiences, because, well, after all, we know that the main market, and please correct me if I'm wrong, usually is the United States, the English-spoken places, the United Kingdom, of course, Australia. However, it's really interesting because you included some elements that locate, obviously, the story. You have talked about the temporality of the story, and you can find that it's a story that only could happen in Canada and only could happen in the period of time. Well, you mentioned that perhaps you have like about 100 years period in there, but it's something really specific. And actually, you mentioned elements like are more known, like the Wendigo, for example, and some elements that you can relate to Canada. So, did you guys found perhaps any problems while trying to include some elements so the story felt like something relevant from your country, from your culture, but you were perhaps afraid that the rest of the world, in this case me, a guy from Mexico, couldn't relate? Or for you it was like, no, don't worry, it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't matter if they get it or they don't.
I'm actually from the States.
Oh,
so I was
there you are.
Like I was kind of in that situation. Like I had to learn a lot about that part of Canadian history and stuff. And I guess like from my perspective, I didn't really have any trouble understanding that. I think partly that's just because it's kind of explained relatively well in the story, and wherever there are like very specific moments, like specific to the country and the time, I think the whole story is still founded on a very human level. Like it's a relatable story. It's something that I think the themes could be pretty universal, and the like specifically Canadian elements don't like overshadow the human side of it that the story is trying to achieve. I think especially with the cosmic horror aspect, that's kind of this huge presence that envelops the entire story. And in my opinion, the cosmic horror genre is very. I enjoy that type of story as a way to just to interpret very human ideas of like one's mortality, or like the way that someone would want to try to face like a big change in their life, or just something that seems something that they can't, it's like impossible to face, and that can be anything that anybody's going through. In this case, in Eulali's case, it has to do with her family, which is, you know, extremely personal, and then it also has to do with a larger picture of what's happening in her country. So her personal journey, represented as this giant black star in the sky hovering over her constantly, is kind of, I don't know, to me that's kind of, it's kind of universal in the way you can tell a very personal story. Yeah. So
I have nothing to add.
Well, whatever she said, it's correct. Yeah. And just some comments from the audience. Sanker11, he's watching us at Twitch, and he's looking for the where he can get this, he can get the story. We have mentioned that you also can get it. It looks like I am promoting the book, which is actually I'm doing in Comixology. You can get this story. You can get the individual issues, and you can get eventually the trade paperback or the digital trade paperback. I don't know if that's the proper way to say it. But there you can get it. And some other things that I want to mention is that last year, looking for, in this case about films only, there was a story that perhaps have some similarities, but in the development of the story is completely different. But perhaps for the newcomer, it can strike a similarity. One question, guys. I believe that you have watched the film Midsummer, right?
Oh my God! Here we go.
It's no, and I know that because it can look like a cheap comparison or something like that, or
it's
something
very relevant to like us and the book.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Do you want to comment a little bit more about that? Because, sorry.
Well, it's just weird. It's funny because like we thought it was just this movie was this weird thing that we like realized was very specific to like early on how we were developing the book. So just to hear you say it is like kind of surprising.
I think, we saw the movie together right after Jenna had finished drawing the first issue. Mm-hmm. And after we saw it, we were both just kind of like, this is weirdly similar to what we're doing.
Yeah.
And not in a way that, it either felt like they were too similar. It was just like a lot of sort of similar themes and similar ways of using horror as the genre to represent very personal family trauma, and then just seeing someone enact that in a film that we both loved and communicated using camera work and stuff to communicate a specific tone similar to what we were going for was I wouldn't say it was like anything was a direct influence, but it was just kind of like seeing it was inspiring for us to go forward with what we were doing.
Yeah, it was very refreshing. I think like before we saw the movie, the theater we saw it at played this little video explaining what folk horror was. And they were citing a lot of movies from the 60s, and I think even the 50s or earlier than that, just kind of delineating what the folk horror genre is all about. And when we saw that, we were just like, okay, that's in our book, that's in our book, that's in our book, that's in our book. And I feel like it's just interesting that genre is kind of at the surface of a lot of movies and I guess comics now. I kind of wonder why that is, like how that's relevant to the way the climate of society is right now. I don't have an answer, but like it's apparent to me that like because we're making this book and other people are making movies like Midsummer and then so on and so forth, there is something that we're all kind of going through that may just the folk horror genre just may resonate with like what we're all going through. So.
Yeah.
But and I know that, for example, the time that you spend developing a project and the time that it is finally published, it doesn't matter if it's a film, if it's a comic book, there's a long time. So it was perhaps a kind of a, not a strange coincidence, but a synchronization in this case, because those were those stories that were kind of similar. Actually, I don't find a lot of similarities because at least in Midsummer, even though I kind of liked the film, there is nothing exotic about a lot of white people just in a Nordic country. And it's like, because seriously, that's a white person, and I say that as a white Mexican, fantasy. Like, let's try to do something similar because we cannot use any kind of other cultures. And in the particular case, in Black Stars Above, it's something that feels natural. As we mentioned before, it's something that feels like it's part of your culture, part of your group, and you are actually the stranger. In this case, the main character, Lily, because she doesn't want to be anymore with her own family. So that's why one of the elements that push her to try to go farther, and then she find this particular place in issue 4 and issue 5 in specific, where she finds this that it's supposed to bring perhaps some comfort, a place where she belongs, and it's really interesting the way that you guys portray the entirety of this community, because and there is a similarity in this case with Midsommar, because they kind of look similar, but then you start looking at the skin, at the way that they are looking, the way that the eyes are actually kind of empty, and then you start feeling like, okay, perhaps this is something more welcoming, but that you have this kind of point and counterpoint, because you don't feel as comfortable as perhaps you should be. So for this kind of, and you have already mentioned that you have watched Midsommar, so for portraying this kind of community, did you base perhaps the characters in any kind of idea that you had from another story, or any kind of perhaps a community that, I don't know if there is a community such like that in some part of Canada?
No, it was like entirely fabricated, but built in line with the lore of the world, and so the community for me was built around the idea of what would a secret British commune that was in Canada for very specific reasons, who was very isolated themselves and who had a very tainted bloodline, what would they look like and what would their beliefs be, specifically at that time when, Britain and Canada were so tied together. And then furthermore, in terms of the way they looked, that was just sort of the way that we imagined them interacting with the Black Stars and the background of the lore that doesn't necessarily make it into the book, but it's all informed by the families, the town's history with these supernatural entities.
Yeah, the way the townspeople looked. Lonnie sent me a lot of reference images of like old medieval denizens, like the townspeople are like just way behind in their era. Like they're trying to stick to this like old ancient set of cultural aspects that are very outdated and old-fashioned.
Yeah, and it was sort of a mix of that and the idea that the Vikings were the first people there, so it was a mix of Viking lineage and British lineage. And so yeah, a lot of the references I gave to Jenna were just like, so the book takes place in 1887, and so a lot of the like clothing references were from like the 1700s, and then there's stuff going way further back to like the Viking era that Jenna managed to somehow mix together.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps we're getting almost at the end of the show. One more thing that I would like to discuss, perhaps a little bit, it's about the supernatural elements. I have read some reviews that this is something that I always conflicted, because they mentioned that perhaps this story even has some science fiction, and I was like, well, it's fiction, but I don't see a lot of science in here. For me, it's more like fantasy, horror, something like that. But let's focus on the creature, or the infant, as it's called. What kind of perhaps influences were you considering for the conceptualization of this particular creature, or well, not creature, this baby?
Bloodborne. That's the answer.
Yeah.
As simple as that.
Yeah.
I sent Jenna a bunch of references early on, one of which was the Bloodborne drawing.
The concept art, yeah.
And I think, I mean, I gave Jenna a very hard task, and I don't want to spoil the book, but the infant itself had to be a mix of two very specific things that don't work together. And I also like asked Jenna, I don't know, a dozen times to like make sure it's not just a Cthulhu monster.
That was challenging, honestly. Like in a cosmic horror story, not having to think about yeah.
And Jenna actually did an original design for the monster first. You should post that at some point.
Okay.
Because it's very different from how it ended up, but equally interesting. And you know, obviously the finished creature is Lovecraftian. Like you can't deny that, but hopefully it doesn't just come across as like a tentacle monster, right? I think there's more intention to the design than that. In a similar way to the way that the Bloodborne in the video game, the creatures are designed are obviously influenced by Lovecraft, but they have their own flavor, and they're part of their own system of lore that helps them stand out as more than just being here's another Cthulhu.
Yeah. Lonnie told me the infant should look kind of pitiful in a way, like you're creeped out by it, but you also feel kind of sorry for it. That was actually a really helpful aspect when he told me that. I thought a lot about the eraser head baby. And, like I applied some of the design to that, but yeah, it was a lot. That was a nice direction besides just like a Lovecraft monster.
Yeah, I think I described it as grotesque sympathetic pity, which is like you probably read that and were like, what the fuck is that?
Like a projection of you. Like, it's projecting.
And it's really interesting because it's an element of the story. We can could say that it's not really, but it's close to a MacGuffin, because in a lot of the different parts of the story, you know that it's in there. It's what actually helps in this case, or character gives her an objective. It gives her a mission. But for example, in a lot of the parts, it's just close in a box. And as the story develops, the way that she's accepting her reality, the way that she's accepting this partner for this journey, it's going around. So that's something that actually helps, I believe, to establishing empathy with the monster, something that different authors like, I don't know, Guillermo del Toro, the Mexican director, is really good at, that you have monsters, but that they are not your enemies. They can be your companions in this particular case.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, Del Toro is like I look up to him a lot, especially in terms of the way he designs his monsters, because he understands and is able to act on his understanding better than anyone. The idea that the monster A needs to garner sympathy, and B, it needs to be representative of something larger than just monstrosity. And you know, I look up to him a lot for many reasons, but that's one of the big ones.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we're pretty much about to finish this transmission, this interview, and I want to thank the people who have been with us. Actually, greetings to Sanker, who has been watching us from Spain, and he says that actually things are getting better where he's located. Saludos, Sanker, and also to the rest of the people who are watching this in YouTube and Facebook. Thanks for being with us. And Lonnie and Jenna, if people want to perhaps see a little bit more about the work that you have been doing, I believe that they can find it really easily, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is my Instagram. Yeah.
Just go looking for Jangling Jack, and I have to ask you about your names, because in Twitter you're also Kale Satan.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so stubborn that like people, when I was younger in school for comics, people were telling me that all my handles needed to be my name so I could be easily searched and stuff. And I was like, I want to see how far I can get away with not doing that. You know?
There
Plus,
you go.
is just, you know, too good. I'm not giving that up.
You can pass up a Nick Cave.
A Nick Cave. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. There you have it. All right, so they can find you on Instagram as Jangling Jack, and you have actually been sharing part of the art, not only from personal projects, but also in this case for Black Stars Above. You can look in there and get to know a little bit more about Jenna and Lon. If they want to read about you, they can also find you, right?
Yep. Yeah, unfortunately, you can find me on Twitter.
With a normal Twitter name.
Yeah.
And there you have it. You can find him as Lonnie Nadler, no longer Lon Monster, and no longer Lonnie Nadler at Hotmail or something like that was in the latest days, I believe.
Yeah.
But don't worry, remember that if you want to find this in the page where we are publishing actually this show, you get the links to the to where to get this title, and also the Instagram and the Twitter handler for, in this case, for Jenna and for Lonnie. So this is pretty much everything. Thanks for all the people who have been watching us and being with us in this conversation, and especially Lonnie, Jenna, thanks. It was a real pleasure talking to you about this book, and believe me, it's really something. And the reviews say it. Pretty much, you got A's all around. And before reading the reviews, I actually read the book, and it's believe me that when I say that this is really something, it's something that it's will transcend, and I'm not kidding when I say that you will get some Eisner nominations, so perhaps the trick will actually work.
Yeah.
But thank you. Thanks so much,
thank
Dan,
you.
and
Yeah.
everyone watching.
Yeah.
All right, so and remember that tomorrow this will be available for download, and it also will be available in the different places. Thanks everybody, and thanks Jenna and Lonnie, and bye.